If this is your first time tuning in, I want to say thank you for checking out the podcast. This is a gaming podcast where I focus on gaming topics outside of the norm. Now, what I mean by that is most gaming podcasts you hear will talk about new games, maybe old games or current games that people are playing, as well as gaming news, what's going on in the industry, the hot button topics. But me, I'm focusing on those questions or conversations that typically pop up whenever you're just having conversations with other gamers. Now, I will say that from time to time, I may talk about some headlines, I may talk about some games in terms of a review aspect, but for the most part, that will be secondary to what my primary focus is. You can find the Bleep Bloop podcast on pretty much all podcast platforms. Just type in Bleep Bloop and it should pop up. You'll know it because of the pink and blue or turquoise logo that says Bleep Bloop on it. You can't miss it. In addition to that, you can follow me on social media on Twitter at Bleep Blue Pod, which is BLEEP BLOOPOD. And if you go to the Twitter, you can check out our website, which is bleepbloopodcast.wordpress.com. Okay, all of the housekeeping is out of the way. Let's talk about this episode's topic, shall we? And that is my first gaming system. Now, this is going to be different for a lot of people. Some of the systems may be the same, but the experience and the stories will all be different for most people. Before I talk about the first system I had, I have to talk about my introduction into gaming. My introduction to gaming started essentially like this. We used to, in the town that I lived in, which was a very small town in New Mexico, there was Pizza Huts. You go to the Pizza Hut, you could sit, eat, and it was a family experience, right? It was a family thing that you did, or just to go get pizza, whatever. Well, when we went, it was very interesting because at a time that we went where they were very popular, they used to have these gaming tables that you could sit down, and under essentially the surface of the table, which was a glass, was a screen that you could play a game. Sometimes the tables would have two games, so they'd have two screens so people would be able to play. And I specifically remember playing games like Pac-Man, 1942, I think Galaga was on there, as well as Space Invaders was another one. I think there were just a variety of different games at that time. But that was my first real experience with video games. Another place I remember was on base. There was a small arcade, and the arcade had video games that were popular, and one of them I remember, I think it was RBI Baseball. All I know was the little characters were small, they were kind of chubby looking, but they all looked the same, minus the different colors representing whatever team it was. So I specifically remember those two things. Now, if you fast forward to the first time I actually got my hands on a system to play, was when the video stores that would rent out VHS movies had consoles for you to play. And I very specifically remember whenever my mom or family members would go out, we would go to my grandma's house and they would rent the game systems, and they would come in this big black briefcase, and you had to put a deposit down, but you could get 4 or 5 games. And I specifically remember getting the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, and we got, of course, Mario and Duck Hunt that came with it, but then we also got Ninja Turtles, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I'll never forget, we were all taking turns playing, and I stayed up all night playing it. I didn't even go to sleep. The sun was coming up and they were like, hey, you need to go to sleep, but I was just hooked on playing that game. And then I remember, there were a couple other times, when I went to my dad's house, he had the Nintendo system. I think he rented it. It was Super Mario Brothers 3. We were playing that, and I actually remember the first time I saw Super Mario 3 was on a movie called The Wizard, and that had Fred Savage and his brother, who I think was autistic, but he was very good at video games. And one of the games they had got on there in the championship with Super Mario Brothers 3. He found the warp whistle, and then he got to warp and then was in the lead, and he actually won the competition, so that was really cool. But my first system I had was Nintendo Entertainment System. And I remember when my mom bought it, I was so excited. You know, I got to play it. We were living in a trailer, and you know, I would just sit in front of the TV and play. And then I remember, I don't know why, but she took it back. It had to have been like a month or two maybe that I had it, and then she just took it back for whatever reason. And I was just so frustrated. I was upset. I was distraught. I remember I just was like, man, she took my Nintendo. But you fast forward to a few years later, I want to say a year and a half later, 2 years later, and I think we were overseas in England, and she bought me another Nintendo. But this time it had the power pack. So it had the orange zapper gun, and it had the power pad. And if you remember the power pad, you know, it had the track and field, but you could just, you know, smack your hands on the pads real fast, and your guy would just like run super duper fast. And that was so cool because I got Super Mario with Duck Hunt, and she didn't take that one back, and I had that for years. I mean, I had that system for years and years and years. I wish I would have took care of it, but you know, growing up the way I did, I was a troublemaker, I was a hoodlum, and I didn't take care of it at all. And who knows where it is now. But that was my first system, and it was just so crazy because even to this day, or you know, you go back a few years, like back to about 2018 when I first started streaming, and I remember I would play retro games because that nostalgia of that first system just stuck with me. I think it's in part one of the big reasons why I still play Metroidvanias, 2D platformers, or pixel graphic games, because there's that association of a time frame when I was a kid that I just enjoyed that still sticks with me and gives me such an appreciation for games. So developers that are out there, keep making those types of games. I love them. I love playing them. I love doing all the platforming. I even love that experience of when you would start a game, the only way you would be able to continue is if it was a game that had like a code, you know, so if you died, it had like a 4-digit code. Like I remember, and we'll talk about some of the games I played, but I remember Adventures of Lolo, if you died on a particular level, it would give you like a 4-digit code, and then you could just put that code in and then keep playing later. But some games, like, you know, once you turn it on, that's it. You can pause it, and you better hope nobody turns your system off. But that was so cool. And then, you know, over time it evolved. Like I think my second system I had was, I never had the Super Nintendo, but I did play it. Just like I never had the Sega, but I did get a chance to play it. But the next real system I had was the Sony PlayStation. I remember that was the first next big system I had. And I mean, I played Crash Bandicoot, Gran Turismo. I remember the demo discs, and I have a podcast episode where I talk about that, where Tekken 3 was on there, and I mastered the guys that were available that you could use to play. Just so many great games. Spyro the Dragon, you know, a lot of fun games. And it wasn't until later in the military that I got the PlayStation 2. But by then, you know, I wasn't so much into games. It wasn't until the PlayStation 3 came out that I got back into games. And then, of course, by the time I had the 4 or 5, of course, I got kids, and I'm really back heavy into games. So it's just funny how the journey has progressed throughout the years. But I still find myself having that nostalgia for the Nintendo. And I have a Raspberry Pi that has over 700 games on it, but I'll still play the same ones that I grew up on, you know, because those are the ones that just stick with me, you know. And another really good game was Rygar. But speaking about games, so the first games I played were, of course, Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, then Super Mario 2, Super Mario 3, Contra was a real big one that I played, Rygar. I remember when Dr. Mario came out, that was a fun one. I didn't really jump into the games that a lot of people played, like Sight Bike or RC Pro-Am or Donkey Kong, like any of those games. I never really dove too deep into those games just because, you know, when I grew up, like my mom could afford 1 or 2 games, but that was about it. You know, it wasn't like we were getting a lot of games. But it wasn't until we got older that I started getting more of those games. It was a very limited amount of games, but one game that absolutely stuck with me, well, actually 2 games, Battletoads and Adventure Adventures of Lolo. Adventures of Lolo is a game that I absolutely love to this day. That is probably one of my all-time favorite games out of every console. And I'm not sure if I talked about that on my favorite games of all time, but that is definitely one of them. I think on that episode I talked about like current gen or last gen, so PS4, PS5. But Adventures of Lolo was absolutely one of my favorite games of all time because of just the leveling, the puzzle solving, and then the song. I mean, I'm probably doing it wrong, but you know, it went something like that. But that was absolutely one of my favorite games. Another game, like I said, was Battletoads. I remember just playing that over and over and over again. And I remember when I got the Game Genie, you know, it gave you like all these cool cheats and abilities that you could use throughout the game. I never, to this day, I still have not beat Battletoads, but that is still one of my favorite games. You know, a lot of the other games, I mean, I can remember a bunch probably playing, but the ones I named are the ones that actually stuck with me. So that was my first game system. What was your first? You know, what is a memory that you have? If you have a memory, reply to the Twitter with your story. Leave a comment wherever you listen to podcasts, add or a review, and leave the story in there. You know, I'd love to hear the story of your first game system. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Bleep Bloop podcast. You know, like I said, you can find it on all platforms. Make sure you follow me on social media at Bleep Blue Pod, BLEEP, that's on Twitter, or you can go to my website, check the website out, bleepbluepodcast.wordpress.com. And until the next episode, y'all, like I always say, peace.